will come to order. Today's hearing on the Department of Homeland Security budget request for fiscal year 2023 will be conducted by a hybrid hearing, so we need to address a few housekeeping matters. For any members joining virtually, speaking into the microphone will activate your camera and display your image on the main screen. Once you start speaking, there will be a slight delay before your image appears on the main screen. Do not stop your remarks if you do not see the screen switch immediately. If the screen does not change after several seconds, please make sure you are not muted. To minimize background noise and ensure the correct speaker is being displayed, we ask that members participating virtually remain on mute unless you have sought recognition. Members are responsible for muting and unmuting themselves. However, I or staff I designate may mute participants' microphones when they are not recognized to speak to eliminate inadvertent background noise. If I notice when you are recognized that you have not muted yourself, I will ask the staff to send you a request to unmute. Please accept that request so you are no longer muted. Members can submit information in writing for any of our hearings using the email address provided in advance to your staff. We will follow the speaking order set forth in the House rules, beginning with the chair and ranking member, and then alternate by party, beginning by members in order of seniority present at the time the hearing is called to order. Now let's begin. This morning, we welcome the Honorable Alejandro Mayorkas, Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, who is here to discuss the department's operations and its fiscal year 2023 budget request. Mr. Secretary, we look forward to a productive discussion this morning. The department has a difficult set of missions, ranging from cybersecurity and the safety of air travel to terrorism preparedness and the protection of our coastal and inland waterways. However, none of those missions is more challenging or fraught than immigration enforcement. I suspect that much of our conversation in this hearing will focus on that topic. Immigration enforcement is complicated and controversial, with policy choices on which members of the subcommittee will strongly disagree. However, I hope there is no disagreement about how challenging your task is under any set of policy assumptions. There are no easy answers because there are competing legal and moral imperatives that are difficult to balance, and we are not and cannot be in full control of all the factors driving migration. We have seen migration surges during Republican and Democratic administrations and Congresses, with no long-term correlation to policy trends. Mr. Secretary, as we hold you accountable this morning for what happens at the border, I am cognizant that Congress is accountable for failing to give the department a realistic legal framework for managing the border, one that ensures the rule of law while ensuring due process and providing better opportunities for legal migration and asylum claims. Immigration reform would not solve all of our problems at the border, but without reform, we are knowingly accepting a status quo that has become increasingly untenable. Mr. Secretary, despite our policy differences on immigration or any other matter, I want you to know that this subcommittee does appreciate what you and the more than 240,000 men and women who work for you do every day to help keep our country safe. I will now turn to the distinguished gentleman from Tennessee, Ranking Member Fleischman, for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Welcome, Mr. Secretary. I sincerely thank you for joining us today, sir. Continuing the dialogue that we had on a bipartisan basis before the Easter break, sir, I think will be important in the weeks to come, and I thank you for that. I am hopeful you can provide some additional insight, sir, into the plan that you released yesterday afternoon that outlines 6 border security pillars to address the historic number of migrants encountered by our agents and officers. The crisis border continues to dominate the headlines in part because of the administration's plans to repeal Title 42, which have now fortunately been blocked by court order, at least temporarily. Roughly half of all migrants your agents and officers encounter illegally crossing the border are subject to removal under Title 42 authority. If that tool goes away, it has the potential to profoundly impact border security operations. Current DHS projections range from 6,000 encounters a month to upwards of 18,000 encounters. Even at the low end, it would mean a new record number of migrants crossing the border. Border patrol stations and immigration infrastructure were designed for single adult men, meaning additional overflow space will be required, and even then will likely be stretched beyond capacity. Before the court order, the CDC determined it was no longer necessary to protect U.S. citizens from COVID transmission. However, at the same time, the CDC attempted to extend federal mask mandates for public transportation, including on aircraft, trains, and local taxis, to May 3rd. Although the mask mandate was also correctly stricken, in my view, by a federal judge, it illustrates the disjointed nature of this administration's COVID policy choices. Beyond the debate around Title 42, this administration continues to send all the wrong messages on border security and immigration enforcement. Administration officials emphasize the push factors that drive people to migrate illegal, such as natural disasters, economic conditions, and the corruption that is endemic to many of the sending countries. However, they rarely, if ever, acknowledge that their actions have a role to play. Policy also drives illegal immigration. Perception drives illegal immigration. Changing both has to be a part of the department's strategy because the current messages being sent, in my view, are contributing factors to the recent surge of illicit migration. Because right now, our current immigration policies are not working. We cannot manage our way out of this crisis with more processing capability or increase the ability of non-governmental organizations to address the near-term humanitarian needs. Many migrants our agents encounter are given a notice to appear and sent on their way into the interior of the United States to await a court date, often years into the future. It only encourages more people to come. A better approach would be to ensure that not only those who with a legitimate fear of only those with a legitimate fear of prosecution or those who come to the country legally are successful. Everyone else must be swiftly removed and sent home. Commitment to enforcement of our immigration law needs to be consistent, and right now there are too many loopholes. Mr. Secretary, I look forward to working with you and your department as we endeavor to seek solutions to address border security crisis at hand. Madam Chairwoman, thank you, and I yield back.
I now turn to the distinguished gentlelady, Ranking Member Carey.
I want to thank the chairwoman for holding this important hearing on the Department of Homeland Security's Fiscal Year 2023 budget. Thank you also, Secretary Mayorkas. I'm sorry, I know you for joining us. We look forward to your testimony today. First, I want to honor Texas National Guardsman Bishop Evans. Specialist Evans lost his life over the weekend, saving 2 migrants from drowning. Our deepest condolences go out to the family and friends of Specialist Evans, as well as the Texas National Guard. Illegal crossings like one Specialist Evans encountered have skyrocketed under his administration. A record number of migrants attempted to cross the border illegally last year, and we're on track for another record-breaking year. On average, our Border Patrol agents encounter 7,000 individuals every day. This is straining the capabilities of our processing and detention facilities. Our agents and officers on the ground do not have the resources to handle numbers this high. The situation will only get worse if the administration is successful in lifting the Title 42 Public Health Authority that has been successfully used to deny entry to illegal migrants during the pandemic. Current projections from the department suggest that without Title 42 authority, the number of migrant encounters could more than double. Tens of thousands of migrants are waiting to cross the border if this authority is lifted. It's been reported that some ICE and CBP accounts could run out of funds as soon as July if President Biden is successful in revoking Title 42. Members on both sides of the aisle agree that now is not the time to stop enforcement of this policy. Thankfully, the administration's plans to suspend the authority have been blocked for now by a federal judge. This administration needs to stop their failed policies and start securing our border. The current policies have allowed cartels and human traffickers to take advantage of gaps in the wall, drug trafficking to surge with fentanyl seizures increasing 134%, the number of deportations to fall by 68%, hundreds of thousands of migrants to be released into the United States. We need common sense solutions that deter illegal immigration, not policies that encourage more of it. Our message must be consistent and clear. The border's not open, and if you try to cross illegally, you will quickly be sent home. I urge the administration to return to the rule of law and get serious about addressing the crisis at the border. Mr. Secretary, I want to extend my sincere appreciation to the men and women of the Department of Homeland Security who dedicate their lives to protect the great nation. And thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Mr. Secretary, we will submit the full text of your official statement for the hearing record. Please begin your oral summary, which I would ask you keep to 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Chairwoman Roybal-Allard, Ranking Member Fleischman, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to join you and testify before you this morning. Every day, the 250,000 extraordinary personnel of the Department of Homeland Security interact with the public on a daily basis more than any other federal agency. While created to respond to a singular threat in the aftermath of 9/11, our department has remained agile, adapting to new challenges as they arise, as responsibilities grow, and as our role increases in scale and scope. The fiscal year 2023 budget is a $97.3 billion investment in our capacity to meet the shifting threat landscape. The resources will give us the tools to protect our communities from terrorism, enhance border security, invest in a safe, orderly, and humane immigration system, counter cyber attacks, safeguard our transportation networks, strengthen disaster preparedness and resilience, and much more. On terrorism and targeted violence, the threat has evolved over the last 2 decades, and we meet this challenge by equipping every level of government, the private sector, and local communities with the tools and resources they need to stay safe. In 2021, for the first time, we designated domestic violent extremism a national priority area in our FEMA grant programs, enhanced training opportunities for law enforcement, and increased our intelligence and information sharing efforts. We are asking for additional funds to expand these operations. In the wake of incidents like the hostage crisis in Colleyville, Texas, we have increased our request for the vital nonprofit security grant program to $360 million to protect houses of worship and other nonprofits from terrorism and targeted violence. Under this administration, our department has been executing a comprehensive strategy to secure our borders and rebuild our immigration system. With the Title 42 public health order set to be lifted, we expect migration levels to increase as smugglers seek to take advantage of and profit from vulnerable migrants. We will continue to enforce our immigration laws. After Title 42 is lifted, non-citizens will be processed pursuant to Title 8, which provides that individuals who cross the border without legal authorization are processed for removal and, if unable to establish a legal basis to remain in the United States, promptly removed from the country. We started our planning last September, and we are leading the execution of a whole-of-government strategy which stands on 6 pillars to prepare for and manage the rise in non-citizen encounters. 1, surge resources, including personnel, transportation, medical support, and facilities. 2, increase efficiency without compromising the integrity of our screening processes to reduce strain on the border. 3, administer consequences for unlawful entry, including expedited removal and criminal prosecution. 4, bolster the capacity of NGOs and coordinate with state, local, and community partners. 5, target and disrupt transnational criminal organizations and human smugglers. 6, deter irregular migration south of our border in partnership with other federal agencies and nations. We inherited a broken and dismantled system that is already under strain. It is not built to manage the current levels and types of migratory flows. Only Congress can fix this. Yet, we have effectively managed an unprecedented number of non-citizens seeking to enter the United States and interdicted more drugs and disrupted more smuggling operations than ever before. A significant increase in migrant encounters will strain our system even further, and we will address this challenge successfully. But it will take time, and we need the partnership of Congress, state and local officials, NGOs, and communities to do so. To build on our ongoing work in this budget, we have requested funding to hire 300 new Border Patrol agents, the first increase since 2011, ensure the safe and humane treatment of migrants, and operationalize a new rule on asylum processing. We are requesting additional funds to counter human and drug smuggling operations, combat the heinous crime of child exploitation and human trafficking, and stop goods produced by forced labor from entering our markets. Finally, our mission set includes a series of other essential priorities. DHS, through the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, protects our critical infrastructure from malicious cyber activity, a threat heightened due to Russia's unprovoked and brutal invasion of Ukraine. Our budget will expand our cybersecurity services, bolster our ability to respond to cyber intrusions, and grow our cyber operational planning activities. DHS, through the Transportation Security Administration, protects the traveling public. Our budget invests in paying TSA's dedicated personnel commensurate with their federal colleagues and ensuring they receive employment protections. DHS, through FEMA and other agencies, continues to answer the risks posed by climate change and natural disasters, growing in ferocity and frequency. Our budget invests in adaptation, resilience, improved response and recovery, and more. We cannot do this alone. DHS is a department of partnerships. I look forward to working with this committee to carry out our wide-ranging mission on behalf of the American people. Thank you.
Mr. Secretary, I have been very concerned by calls for continuing the use of Title 42 expulsion authority at the border, and I was alarmed by the recent court order that at least temporarily would prohibit the planned end of Title 42 next month. Even though this authority is legally premised on the mitigation of public health risks, there can be no denying that it has also helped CBP manage the border by reducing the number of people that require processing. But that is not a legally sufficient reason to continue it, and it would fly in the face of the legal due process rights of migrants. My question is, do you believe it is time for the use of Title 42 authority to end at the border? And can you discuss how DHS is estimating the impact of ending Title 42 on the flow of migrants, including the assumptions behind the estimates we have heard of up to 18,000 individuals per day?
Madam Chairwoman, as you have correctly identified, Title 42 is a public health authority that rests in the exclusive jurisdiction of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, an agency within the Department of Health and Human Services. It is based on their expert assessment of the public health needs of the American public, and they decide whether the Title 42 authority, remains necessary, remains a public health imperative based on the public health data that they obtain and their expert decision based on it. Our responsibility in the Department of Homeland Security is to implement the Title 42 authority of the CDC at our border and to implement it effectively and judiciously according to the law. We are mindful that there can be an increase in migratory flows encountered at our southern border should Title 42 come to an end, as the CDC has determined it needs to do by May 23rd. Our responsibility, therefore, is to prepare and plan for that eventuality. And we have been mindful of the fact that the Title 42 authority would not be in place forever, and therefore we began our extensive planning and preparation since September of last year, and we have been doing so. And I outlined the 6 pillars of our plan that really have guided our day-to-day preparation since the fall of last year. And we are preparing for different scenarios. It is very difficult to predict the level of migration that we will encounter once Title 42 comes to an end, and we are planning and preparing for different scenarios as a result. That is what we do. We plan, we prepare, and we execute in the service of our mission.
Now the estimates of 18,000 individuals, are those estimates based on a country-by-country projection? And what do the estimates mean in the short term as you consider the department's funding and resource needs?
Madam Chairwoman, we haven't estimated the level of increase that we might experience, but what we have done is develop different scenarios and plan to each and every one of those scenarios. It is very important, I think, that everyone understands that an increase in migratory flows is not something unique to the United States. This is something that countries throughout the region, throughout the Western Hemisphere, and as we have seen so powerfully and regrettably throughout the world. We have seen more than 5 million Ukrainians flee their country that has been so brutally attacked by Russia. We have Colombia in the southern part of our hemisphere experiencing more than 1.8 million Venezuelans within its borders. I recently traveled to Costa Rica, to Panama, and heard from other countries with respect to the similar challenges that they are facing. These challenges are brought about and made more acute by the COVID-19 pandemic, but some of the causes of irregular migration have only been heightened in years of distress preceding this administration. Economic downturn, an increase in violence, the significant impacts of climate change. These are the forces that drive people to leave their homes that they have established and in which they have grown up for years.
And do you think that the extra $1.4 billion that Congress already provided for this fiscal year will be enough?
Madam Chairwoman, we appreciate the $1.4 billion that were provided to the Department of Homeland Security to address this situation. We have, of course, submitted to Congress a spending plan for that amount of money. We have an obligation to the American public to manage our funding in a fiscally responsible way, and that is indeed what we are doing. We are planning to reprogram funds as is necessary, and of course, we will be open and forthcoming with Congress with respect to those plans. We are also preparing, should reprogramming not be sufficient, to request a supplemental. We have not reached that point. We are going to try to avoid that to the best of our abilities, and we will be in constant communication with this committee, and we appreciate this committee's support.
Mr. Fleischman.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Thank you again, Mr. Secretary. Mr. Secretary, the Biden administration, through the Centers for Disease Control, attempted to end the Title 42 Public Health Authority effective May the 23rd. However, a temporary restraining order now prevents the administration from doing so. DHS's internal estimates provide several scenarios for the number of border crossers that may cross if we lift Title 42. Projections were as high as 18,000 encounters a day. My first question, sir, would DHS have been prepared if not for the court order, sir?
Ranking Member Fleischman, thank you very much for your question. It is our responsibility to plan and prepare for eventualities that might materialize. We started to plan and prepare for the end of Title 42, commencing in September of last year, in September of 2021. We have been preparing every single day since then. Yesterday, I published a memorandum that set forth the pillars, the 6 pillars that undergird our planning and preparation so that everyone can understand the extent of the planning and preparation that we have undertaken. As I articulated in response to the chairwoman's question, it is our responsibility to plan and prepare and to execute upon those plans to address the challenges that are before us, and they are varied, and as varied as our mission is expansive.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Secretary, even if we don't lift Title 42, we are going to see this year record number of migrant encounters at the border. Do you believe, sir, that we need to implement additional consequences for illicit border crossers?
Ranking Member Fleischman, what we fundamentally need is legislation to fix what everyone agrees is a broken immigration system. That is the one thing in the immigration sphere as to which there is unanimity. The 6 pillars of our plans that I outlined in a memorandum yesterday are 6 pillars that we are executing upon whether or not Title 42 comes to an end. And one of those pillars is indeed the consequences for entering our country in between a port of entry without having a legal basis to remain in this country. Individuals who make a claim for relief under our laws, whose claims do not succeed in immigration court proceedings, are removed from this country, and we are employing our authorities to effect those removals as swiftly as possible.
Thank you, sir. You've already alluded to this in your testimony, but yesterday DHS released a plan for Southwest border security and preparedness, which outlines your plan to surge resources and address the anticipated increase in border crossings when and if Title 42 is lifted. The first pillar of the plan is to surge resources to the Southwest border, including support and medical personnel. Presumably, these additional personnel come from other components throughout DHS. My question, sir, what is the impact to those agencies who rely on these individuals as they are deployed to help alleviate the preventable border surge?
Congressman, not all of those resources come from other parts of the department, and I want to identify one very important example that illustrates my point. I've been to the border approximately 8 times, and in my last visit, I heard loudly and clearly the concerns of our heroic, incredibly dedicated Border Patrol agents about their need for additional support so that they can get out into the field and interdict individuals seeking to evade law enforcement and cross our border illegally. And in the service of that need, we have hired contract personnel, case processing personnel, so that they can do the processing of individuals who have sought to enter our border illegally, to process them into our system and allow those Border Patrol agents out into the field. We have contracted for 300 case processors, and we have the capacity to plus up that force. That does not come from within the department. We are using our contracting authorities very effectively and efficiently to achieve that mission.
Mr. Secretary, thank you. Madam Chair, I'll yield back and wait for round two. Thank you.
Mr. Cuellar.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here. I think the job of this subcommittee is to provide to the resources and hopefully some guidance to do your job, because you're right, migration has been happening all over the world for war, economic droughts, name it, for many, many years. So it's not a matter of how do we control the border, but how do we manage the border. Your plan that you laid out, actually, I think it can work. 3 of them are to deal with the border. How do you move people out of the border in a more humane, efficient way? But I'm interested in the 3 other ones that address the issues of expedited removals and what we do with those other countries. Instead of playing defense on the 1-yard line, what are we doing to work with the other countries? First thing is, and I'm going to ask very specific questions, the Laredo sector and the Rio Grande sector are operating at 40%. That means that 60% of the men and women are in the processing centers, and 40% actually doing Homeland Security. It's like having a school and only 40% of the teachers are in the classroom and the other ones are doing something else. The border processing coordinators is something that we started many years ago, and we still haven't ramped up. I know I heard you say 300, but we should have done that a long time ago to put those folks in the processing centers and our men and women outside. I hope you all can move on that quicker, because I think it will be key to get the other 60% of the Border Patrol folks out in the field to do Homeland. Number 2, the asylum officers, this is why I see this, and I brought this so many times. If somebody is coming from a country, from another part of the world, doesn't have to be only the Central American countries, they pass through country A. Country A can give them asylum. They can ask for asylum. They don't ask that. Then they pass through country B. They could do the same thing, ask for asylum, but they don't ask for them, but they want to come to the United States. But they probably pass 2, 3, 4 countries where they could have asked for asylum. Do your asylum officers take that in consideration, where their fear could have been taken care of in country A, B, C, or D, depending where they're coming from? And I know the immigration judges are not under your department, it's a different department, but is that something that they take in consideration? Because I think a lot of these issues can be addressed very quickly, because if the question is, how do you take care how do you address the credible fear? I think that credible fear could have been taken care of. And the reason I say that is I've been with Border Patrol. Well, I find the 45-day permit, some time ago from Mexico, and then the relief that they've been given in Chile or some other countries, but they drop them off and they're starting new. Is that something that the asylum officers look at?
Congressman, if I can answer the different questions.
Yes, sir.
That you have posed to me, and I will do so as quickly as I can. I very much appreciate your recognition of the importance of the case processors. That's why, from my last visit to the border, I equipped the case processors with additional tools to magnify their portfolio and allow more agents out in the field. We've already brought more case processors on, and we'll be bringing on 300 more and plus up from there. So very much appreciate your recognition of their importance. The asylum officers, Congressman, right now are working in a system where the average length of time between the time of encounter and the final adjudication of an asylum case is 6 to 8 years. A stark example of how broken our immigration system is. For the first time, this administration has promulgated an asylum officer rule that will allow the asylum officers to make that ultimate asylum adjudication, and that will take that 6 to 8 year period and reduce it to under a year without compromising due process. That is a game changer, Congressman. With respect to your point about the migratory flows from country to country, ultimately, potentially to our southern border, because the promise of America is the greatest promise in the world. That is precisely why I was in Panama last week to speak with my counterparts and the foreign secretaries, along with Secretary Blinken, with the foreign secretaries, the security secretaries of countries throughout the region to speak about their border management, the humanitarian relief that they could provide, the responsibilities they have to provide that relief according to their laws, and to repatriate individuals who do not qualify for relief under their laws. This is a regional, hemispheric challenge, and it needs to be met with a regional, hemispheric response. And we continue to work with countries in the region, last week in Panama, in June at the Summit of the Americas, and every day in between.
Thank you.
Ms. Granger.
Thank you. Since Congress blocked the administration proposal to rescind funding for wall construction, you have a balance of roughly $2.5 billion available. I understand that some of that funding will be used to fix problems created from the decision to cancel the wall contracts midstream, such as closing gaps and building gates. The remaining funds must be spent on wall construction. So please tell us exactly how you plan to spend the funds. If you can't provide an answer now, when will you be able to share this information?
Congresswoman, thank you very much for your question. Indeed, we are closing gaps and completing gates. I approved, I believe, approximately 68 projects in furtherance of that effort, and we are well aware of our responsibility to spend the funds that have been appropriated to the wall, and we are undertaking an analysis of how most effectively to do so while honoring the President's commitment. We are dedicated to spending those funds in a way that enhances safety and security, and we will provide you with a plan that gives you more details in that regard. But we're very well aware of our obligations, and we will execute on those obligations in adherence to your authority.
Thank you.
Ms. Underwood.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Secretary, thank you for being with us today. It's great to see you. I'm a nurse, so today I want to focus on DHS's policies around medical care. These policies are incredibly important, and they help keep DHS personnel, migrants, and most especially our communities safe. Since you've taken office, you've made significant improvements on this front, especially regarding the well-being of unaccompanied children, where the last administration fell beyond short of reflecting our values and meeting our standards. That is thanks to changes made under your leadership, and I want to recognize your efforts and those of DHS staff. However, there's still a lot more work that needs to be done. Let's start with vaccinations. I've been advocating for DHS to offer the COVID-19 and influenza vaccines to people in its custody for years now, and finally, on March 28th, the administration announced that CBP would begin offering the COVID-19 vaccine. We know that vaccines save lives, and this policy will protect migrants and the DHS personnel serving at our borders. When DHS began implementing this plan 1 month ago, DHS officials said that you'd initially be able to provide up to 2,000 vaccines per day at 11 locations along the border. Officials also stated that your plan was to increase capacity to 6,000 vaccines per day at 27 locations by the end of May. Are you on track to hit this goal?
Congresswoman, thank you very much for your concern with respect to the medical and health well-being of individuals whom we encountered at our southern border. Very well aware of your experience and your dedication to this issue. We are on track, thanks to the extraordinary leadership of our physicians and their support personnel, and we are gearing forward to meet the objective of vaccinating up to 6,000 migrants a day in more than 20 facilities across the border.
Great. How many migrants have been vaccinated at the border since you began this policy in March? And can you share any additional details on implementation?
Congresswoman, I would have to and will provide you with that data subsequent to this hearing. I don't have that detail with me this morning.
Okay, thank you. Like I mentioned, Chairwoman DeLauro and I have called on CBP to offer flu vaccines to people in its custody since 2019. Even before the COVID-19 pandemic, CDC urged Customs and Border Protection to administer the flu vaccine to people in its custody. With DHS now administering the COVID-19 vaccine, can we expect the department to expand this program to include the flu vaccine in the future?
Forgive me, in an architecture that we established to, for example, test, isolate, and quarantine non-citizens whom we've encountered. So we've been working very closely with non-governmental organizations to advance the public health needs of the population.
Okay, well, I'm very supportive of all efforts to expand vaccination, and I look forward to your continued partnership on that. Now I'd like to discuss the Chief Medical Office reorganization, which has been one of my and Chairwoman Roybal-Allard's top priorities over the past year. I'm so proud that the Fiscal Year 22 Omnibus included our provision allowing for the establishment of a new Executive Management Office led by the CMO to better lead and coordinate the department's medical and public health priorities and operations. The current structure, where the CMO reports to the Countering Weapons of Mass Destruction Office instead of directly to you, sir, has led to disjointed and isolated medical efforts in the department. I know it's early, but can you share with the committee any plans and timelines you have for developing this new office?
Congresswoman, thanks to you and thanks to the chairwoman for supporting this effort. It is reflective of our desire to bring greater integration to the entire department, and in this mission set, it is so imperative. It is thanks to our chief medical officer, other physicians, other personnel, that we've been actually able to provide medical care and the needs of our workforce and the public whom we serve effectively despite a suboptimal organization. We are developing detailed plans. We look forward to working with you in this committee on the execution of those plans, and we're doing so as rapidly as possible. This is a really terrific opportunity for us, and we're grateful that you've created it.
Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Palazzo.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Ranking Member, for holding this hearing. Secretary Mayorkas, thank you for taking the time to speak to us today. As you may know, my district lines the Mississippi Gulf Coast and has 2 ports of entry where CBP agents are stationed. We have 2 U.S. Coast Guard small boat stations, and we got what I believe to be 2 of the greatest shipbuilders in America right in my backyard. One building the National Security Cutter and the other building the first polar security cutter in over 50 years. And so I would like to extend an open invitation for you to visit the Mississippi Gulf Coast at any time. I'd like to be a part of your trip. The last time you testified before this subcommittee, I had just returned from a trip to the southwest border with several members of the Border Security Caucus. I'm appalled by the fact that it has been a year since you sat before us last, and the only change regarding the situation at the southwest border is that the situation has got much worse. This administration's lax policies and opening the borders not just allow immigration to occur, it has opened the floodgates for nefarious activity and burdened the DS agencies that have the responsibility to respond. This just isn't affecting the border, but it's also affecting local and state law enforcement all across America, not just border states. The CBP agents I spoke with while visiting the border begged us to fight for the continuation of Title 42 because their facilities and their staffing levels cannot handle the massive influx that would occur if they were reversed. How can this administration literally file lawsuits to keep CDC COVID-19 protocols inflicted on American people in planes and public transportation, but alternatively want to drop the COVID-19 protocol for non-citizens immigrants under Title 42 at the border?
Congressman, thank you, first of all, for your kind invitation to visit your jurisdiction, and I will accept that invitation and look forward to joining you there. And I I cannot overstate the importance of the national security cutters and our appreciation for this committee's support for the polar security cutter, which is of such vital importance, especially as our Arctic strategy becomes more important with other nations' aggressions in that area. Congressman, as I said at the very outset, Title 42 is an authority that the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention exercises. It is their authority exclusively and not ours. Our job is to implement plans according to whether or not that authority continues to be exercised in their decision-making. Let me be clear that we are mandating vaccines for individuals whom we encounter at the southern border. We are building our vaccination capacity, and those individuals who are not vaccinated are subject to detention if they are not already subject to detention for independent law enforcement means. Individuals who cross our border are placed in immigration enforcement proceedings. They make claims for relief under our law. If they do so and those claims succeed, then they have established a legal basis to remain. If those claims do not succeed, then they are expeditiously removed from our country.
The well-resourced cartels, gang members, human traffickers, and drug smugglers will exploit this crisis to further endanger American citizens. A group of 130-plus members of Congress wrote to you calling on you to immediately take all legal and necessary actions at your disposal, of which there are many, to secure the southern border, rectify the dangerous policies this administration has put in motion over the past year, and bring your agency into compliance with the laws passed by the United States Congress. How much has it cost the Department of Homeland Security to cancel, pause, or otherwise halt construction of physical barriers along the southern border authorized and appropriated by law?
Congressman, let me say a few things in response to your question, because we are implementing the laws that Congress has passed, and we are doing so effectively, focusing on the greatest public safety, national security, and border security threats. We are exercising prosecutorial discretion, a long established and long-held best practice. We are doing so effectively to have the greatest law enforcement impact, number one. Number two, you mentioned the cartels, the transnational criminal organizations. We have intensified our efforts to attack them and have done so in unprecedented ways, and I welcome the chance to provide details with respect to how we are doing so, not only as the Department of Homeland Security, but in collaboration with other federal agencies and state and local law enforcement agencies. The wall projects, the majority of them rest in the jurisdiction of the Army Corps of Engineers. Those that we ourselves control, I believe that the cost of discontinuing them is approximately $72 million, and I will follow up with you to ensure the accuracy of my statement this morning. Thank you, Congressman.
Yeah, thank you. Please do. I yield back.
Mr. Ruppersberger.
Thank you, Ms. Secretary. You have a very difficult job. I think right now you're dealing with the issues the way you should, and we hope to support you as much as we can. To begin with, at the request of the department, the F-22 Homeland Security Appropriations Act provided funds for an incident management assistance team called IMAC, primarily for incidents that are not declared emergencies or disasters under the Stafford Act or paid from the Disaster Relief Fund, and that's called DRF. Acronyms everywhere. I represent a coastal district which is prone to flooding. More than not, these events are not classified as major disaster declarations. However, it certainly doesn't feel that way to my constituents who live there. And as such, I'm a big supporter of the IMAC model and would like to raise the program's profile in the committee. Now, one, can you explain what IMAC is and what they do and the status of the new team?
Congressman, we are so appreciative of your support of IMAT. IMAT brings different planning, preparation, and execution capabilities to bear in response to an incident. It's all about preparation, planning, response, and resilience. And the IMAT structure provides an integrated approach to that mission set. And indeed, it is an authority that we have exercised in the context of natural disasters under the Stafford Act, but we are indeed expanding it further thanks to your championing that program. I should also expand further because the IMAT structure is the optimal way to address challenges, whether they be Stafford Act, outside the Stafford Act, natural disasters, or challenges of a different nature. And that is why we are actually in the midst of developing the IMAT capability throughout the department to address whatever challenges we might face. Of course, FEMA is most experienced in that, as is the United States Coast Guard. We're bringing that capability throughout the department. That is one of our core initiatives in the 12 priorities that I outlined for fiscal year 2022, 6 of which are built on organizational advancement, 6 of which are focused on mission advancement.
And you mentioned FEMA. Why is it beneficial for FEMA to have an IMAT team that is not funded by DRF?
Because, Congressman, FEMA addresses so many different types of challenges. Some, of course, fall within the Stafford Act declaration construct, and some that don't. And to your point that you made at the very outset, to your constituents, the Stafford Act isn't necessarily the line they draw when they are confronting a challenge that jeopardizes their well-being. And therefore, that is not the best line to differentiate when the IMAC capability is brought to bear to address a challenge.
Can this team be used for disasters and emergencies declared under the Stafford Act if needed?
It certainly can,
There's plenty of
Congressman.
flexibility there.
It can, and we're building that capability to address all sorts of challenges. And in fact, the Southern Border Coordination Center that I directed be created to address the challenge at the southern border is led by an IMAT expert from FEMA who brings that capability to bear. We are bringing all of our capabilities across the department to address that challenge and to address others.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Ms. Henson?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Ranking Member Fleischman. Thank you, Secretary, for coming before us today to answer our questions. And I know the timing of this hearing is incredibly important given the chaos that's happening at our southern border right now. We know those numbers from March were well over 200,000 encounters with illegal immigrants, a 500% increase over 2020, incredibly alarming to me. In our communities, I just did a town hall last week, heard from our local law enforcement. They see the federal government as failing at its mission at the southern border, and they are having to deploy resources locally to counter for that. It's frustrating to me that I feel like here we are again after a year. We were giving these warnings a year ago about the situations, not only at our border communities, for our law enforcement officers, not only down in Texas, but in places like Iowa, who continue to raise the alarm that this crisis has worsened. And so I think this is a direct result, the compounding that we're seeing at our southern border of this problem of this administration's policies. I think it's ludicrous that you're saying comprehensive and deliberate strategy since January of 2021, and yet here we are with a worsening and compounding crisis at our southern border. So I had a chance to visit the southern border last April. I had a chance to connect with Customs and Border Patrol agents in the Del Rio sector. We know Title 42 has been a very useful tool for Border Patrol to help process people at our southern border. I heard that directly from agents. They were asking for this to be permanent. I think if our president and our vice president also had a chance to go down and see this in person, they would hear that directly from them as well. So I would ask you to convey that to the president and the vice president that they need to go see it in person as well. Because of this policy, we're hearing from the DHS Inspector General. General Kafari was before our committee a few weeks ago as well. He said there are 100,000 migrants waiting for this policy to end, just sitting there. We know that number is going to increase as well. And when we see Border Patrol being severely undermanned, and I know you're asking for more agents, but when 60% of them are not doing their job as intended, that's a huge hole. So have you talked to Border Patrol agents on the ground at our southern border? What are they telling you about the end of Title 42 and the anticipation of that policy changing? We'd be interested in what you're hearing from the agents.
Congresswoman, thank you so very much. Of course, I have much to say in response to the statements that preceded your question, but allow me to respectfully disagree with much of what you said and to just answer your question. As I said earlier this morning before this committee, I visited the border 8 times now in my role as secretary, and I have visited it previously in my role as the deputy secretary and in other capacities throughout my more than 20 years in federal service. The Border Patrol agents are doing their job every single day. We need to get them out in the field to interdict individuals who are seeking to cross our border illegally, and that is why, as I've said previously, we're really ramping up the case processing capabilities to get those Border Patrol agents out in the field. Some certainly have said to me that Title 42 has been of utility to them, despite the level of recidivism that Title 42 can prompt, because please remember that under Title 42, individuals are expelled, they're not formally removed in immigration proceedings, and therefore they do not have a record of removal. And what we are seeing is the number of encounters, not necessarily the number of unique individuals reflected in the numbers that you have cited. But some of them have certainly requested that Title 42 remain, and I have explained to them, as I have shared with this committee, that the law provides that that is a public health authority, not an immigration policy, and the CDC controls the exercise of that authority according to its assessment of the public health need.
So if CBP is understaffed and agents are, in many of these cases, coming to you and saying, hey, we probably need this policy to be permanent, how does this work with ICE? We know ICE beds are underutilized right now. These agencies should be working together to handle this increased influx. What are we doing with the additional ICE beds and the detention beds for the people who are being brought into a country and who are not being expelled quickly?
Congresswoman, U.S. Customs and Border Protection and Immigration and Customs Enforcement are working hand in glove as part of the SBCC, the Southern Border Coordinating Center, and they have worked hand in glove before I directed the creation of that center. Detention is being used in furtherance of our prosecution efforts. We focus our detention resources on the greatest public safety, national security, and border security threats. That is where we have the greatest law enforcement impact, and we continue to exercise our detention authority, our prosecution authorities in the service of those 3 primary goals.
Thank you. I'll yield back.
Mr. Quigley.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Mr. Secretary, I represent Chicago, Ukrainian village, and one of the largest Ukrainian populations in the country. They want to know how to get Ukrainian refugees there. But let's start at the border in that regard. What is your understanding of the numbers of Ukrainians, refugees that have come to the southern border here, and how many have been processed and how many remain?
Congressman, thank you very much for your concern about the Ukrainians who have fled their country, which has been so brutally attacked. We have focused resources on the port of entry at San Ysidro, where the majority of Ukrainians who flew to Mexico with the hope of entering the United States assembled. We have drawn down that population of Ukrainians dramatically. We surged resources of U.S. Customs and Border Protection. I will provide you with the specific details and the numbers that you have requested. But let me, if I can, take a step back, because our efforts are extensive with respect to providing humanitarian relief for individuals who have fled war-torn Ukraine. We deployed immediately refugee affairs officers to the region to be able to begin to administer refugee applications of Ukrainians. We just stood up Uniting for Ukraine, a very innovative humanitarian relief program that makes humanitarian parole available to Ukrainians who have a sponsor in the United States. Of course, we are also assessing humanitarian parole requests on an individualized basis before we stood up the Uniting for Ukraine program. The Department of State recently issued guidance with respect to the issuance of visas for Ukrainians who want to come to the United States temporarily, understanding that their hope is to be able to return to their country and enjoy the sovereignty that is part of our international norms and our international architecture. And I so very much appreciate your concern for the people of Ukraine.
No, and I appreciate your mentioning all those coming from war-torn countries. It's my hope indeed that the millions who have left Ukraine shines a light on the problem worldwide, and obviously we should care just as much about those leaving Afghanistan, Africa, Yemen, and so forth, and I appreciate your efforts there. Again, we're curious, the number of Ukrainians who've come through the southern border, how many are still waiting? And there was concern among my constituents that that Unite for Ukraine would say, we're going to do this, but at some point we're going to stop allowing this through the southern border. Could you explain what that situation is and how we're alerting people about that possibility?
Thank you very much, Congressman. I should say that in addition to the efforts that I articulated in response to your first question, we of course also granted temporary protected status for those Ukrainian nationals who are already resident in the United States because it is not safe, of course, to return to their country at this time. We believe that if indeed Ukrainians fleeing Ukraine want to come to the United States and seek relief, humanitarian relief here in the United States, the most effective and efficient and assured process is to actually proceed through our means that I have outlined directly and not seek to go to the southern, to Mexico and enter through a port of entry. That is not the way to do it. And
but you, excuse me, you can appreciate the fact that they're in the middle of a war and they're making decisions in a hurry.
yes,
So how are we messaging through Ukraine and places like Warsaw and other countries that they would leave from to understand what the other options are?
And we are messaging that not only to the Ukrainian diaspora already present in the United States, but we are messaging that through our public communications in the region, through our international partners, through our consular officers. We are indeed getting that word out.
And the word about how to use Unite for Ukraine.
Correct. How to use Uniting for Ukraine, how to apply for a visa, what is the availability and means of accessing our refugee program, all of the different humanitarian channels that we've made available.
Thank you.
Mr. Rutherford.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Ranking Member, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here this morning. I want to follow up on the Ukraine refugee issue. We have a large influx that have come across the southern border in my district now. And I was really glad to hear, I think it was last Monday, when the Uniting for Ukraine was laid out, because we had heard the commitment to bring 100,000, but there hadn't been any rulemaking for that, I suppose. But so my question is, in light of the fact that we still have Afghans 6 months who are trying to come through the same process, how long do we expect the Ukrainians to have to wait to be able to properly come through to America as well? Do we have an idea on how long that's going to take?
Congressman, thanks so much for this important question. we are focused on meeting the urgency of the moment. And we did exactly that through Operation Allies Welcome, when we were able to build a parole program where the parole determinations, according to law, were made on an individualized case-by-case basis, but we paroled more than 73,000 Afghan nationals within a matter of weeks. We intend to and are designing our program and actually underway in its implementation to meet the urgency of the moment with respect to the needs of Ukrainians who fled their war-torn country. And so we are prioritizing that. I cannot overstate the challenge, because please remember that the agency that is on point for that, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services within the Department of Homeland Security, has not had adequate funding for more than 7 years. It was entirely dismantled, and we're in the process of rebuilding it. What the workforce of that agency has done, a characteristic of the workforce throughout the Department of Homeland Security, is truly extraordinary.
But those same USCIS employees are being surged to the southern border to now process those people. So you're exacerbating the situation with USCIS. So my question, two questions on Ukraine still. Those that are under the parole situation in Uniting for Ukraine, what benefits are those individuals in my district? What other than being able to work through a work authorization, are they going to receive other benefits? Can you tell me that?
Congressman, let me, if I can, just address very briefly the statement that you made after my first response. We're not only dealing with a broken immigration system, we're dealing with a broken immigration system that was dismantled in its entirety in the prior administration, and so we're rebuilding it. With respect to the Ukrainians, those individuals who are granted parole are able to apply for work authorization and able to work lawfully in the United States. They gain lawful presence. They are not entitled to all of the benefits, of course, that American citizens are entitled. And I can outline—
Not all, but are there, can you give me a list of those benefits that they do have a right to so that we can be sure that, I've got a lot of Ukrainians in my district, and I want to make sure that we're doing all we can for them.
And Congressman, I so very much appreciate that, and I will provide you with that list subsequent to this. And I should say that we're working very closely with the private sector to partner
The NGOs.
in providing, yes, NGOs, and not only that, the business community, to match individuals with jobs for which they qualify, to address any housing needs that they might have. We've exercised these capabilities very ably through Operation Allies Welcome and what we did for the Afghan nationals and continue to do. And so we draw lessons from that capability and apply it to other urgencies. And I'd be pleased to walk through that with you.
Thank you. Madam Chair, I see my time has expired. I yield back.
Mr. Aguilar.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here. Mr. Secretary, I wanted to return briefly to the discussion of ending Title 42. Like my colleagues, I believe that we need to manage our southern border in an orderly fashion. However, we must ensure that we treat migrants at our borders with compassion, dignity, and respect, regardless of the country that they are traveling from. Yesterday, the department released their plan for the Southwest Border Security and Preparedness, which demonstrates ways to process migrants safely and quickly. The plan details how DHS is coordinating with NGOs and local stakeholders. So my question is, can you provide some additional clarity and detail about the engagement that DHS is making with NGOs and stakeholders on our southern border? What types of engagements have been made at the border, as well as in communities where migrants might be placed, with case management and ATD alternatives to detention services?
Congressman, thanks so very much. So I think one of the most powerful examples of how we've worked with the NGO community across the southern border is in the dispensation of medical care to migrants in need. we built an entire architecture through the capabilities of our chief medical officer and his team to have NGOs, non-governmental organizations, nonprofit organizations build the capacity to test, isolate, and quarantine migrants, and also to be able to reimburse them for their expenses through our FEMA programs that are pass-throughs through the state when the states were cooperative with us. That's a shining example of how we leveraged civil society, non-governmental society, to assist in addressing the needs of individuals. We are taking that example and applying it in other respects as well. Other types of medical care, social service needs, uniting with family members here during the pendency of immigration enforcement proceedings. We're working with the NGOs across the border, and we're also very focused on communicating more robustly with state and local communities and seeing how we can support them and how we can better coordinate with them across the enterprise.
Thank you. Yeah, the plan that you release also talks about a successful pilot program on en route processing. As the name alludes to, this program allows CBP to process individuals in transit to NGO shelters or to the border. Can you elaborate on this program and the efficiencies that it'll bring to processing migrants? What type of metrics you look at and utilize to determine whether this is successful and how we scale this up, and the guardrails that are in place to make sure that individuals can still make a case for credible fear during the en route processing as well?
Congressman, this is a one element of an overarching effort to bring greater efficiency to the processing of individuals whom we encounter at the border. I spoke in my plan, and it's in greater detail, of course, how we're digitizing A-files to bring greater efficiency. En route processing is a very practical solution to a compelling need to decompress Border Patrol stations. I have said time and time again, for example, that the Border Patrol station is no place for an unaccompanied child. It is also no place for overcrowding. And so for individuals who are going to be in transit from a Border Patrol station, perhaps for several hours, why not take some of the processing that we would perform in the Border Patrol station and actually equip our personnel, our case processors, to perform some of that processing while those individuals are in transit away from the Border Patrol station and to one of our other facilities, for example. That's just practical efficiency. And we are piloting it with the hope of scaling it, not just to meet the southern border challenge, but to actually decompress Border Patrol stations on an enduring basis. That's the type of efficiency that we are creating as we meet the challenge at our southern border.
What are the metrics that you're looking at? How will you define success and scale this pilot up?
The success is the impact that we will have in the decompression of the Border Patrol stations.
Measured by hours of processing?
Yes, the speed with which, and I was about to say, Congressman, the speed with which we process. And one thing is very important to emphasize, and I cannot overstate its importance, without compromising the accuracy and security of the processing that we undertake.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you, Madam Chair.
That concludes the first round of questioning, so we're going to go into a second round. I would like to go back to the impact of Title 42. And my question has to do with how you will process 18,000 migrants per day while keeping time in custody below the 72 hours and still be able to ensure due process without compromising necessary vetting.
Congresswoman, Madam Chairwoman, the 18,000 is not projected. As I mentioned, we just built that scenario so that we can plan for different scenarios. We scale it at different levels and plan accordingly to be able to ensure that our preparations, our extensive preparations, are comprehensive. There is no question that if we encounter 18,000 people in a single day, that will seriously strain our capabilities. I just need to be clear in that regard. You mentioned the 72-hour legal time frame, and that applies to unaccompanied children specifically. And we proved in March of 2021 the capability that we could have when we see a number of unaccompanied children encountered at our southern border. What we did is we deployed our expertise and our personnel. As a Congressman Ruppersberger mentioned, the IMAC team, we brought that capability to bear to build greater capacity in health and human services, to shelter those individuals, and greater efficiencies in the Department of Health and Human Services to unite those unaccompanied children with a qualified parent, legal guardian, or family relative. From those lessons that we developed in March of 2021 and in the ensuing weeks, the capability that we brought to bear to the Department of Health and Human Services, we apply those in our operational planning now, and we'll implement them accordingly.
Is there a plan to ensure that all migrants not placed into expedited removal will be fully processed and given a confirmed court date on their notice to appear?
Madam Chairwoman, I believe that there is a Supreme Court precedent that requires certain details to be included in a notice to appear, and we will comply with the law as we always do.
Okay. And will migrants who are released be enrolled in alternatives to detention, and will they be provided with case management services?
Madam Chairwoman, if I can just take a step back and emphasize one point, that individuals who are encountered at the southern border are placed in immigration enforcement proceedings. Those who pose a public safety threat, a national security threat, a threat to border security, are placed in detention. We have increased our capacity to apply alternatives to detention, and we continue to augment those resources thanks to the support of this committee. And so we will apply alternatives to detention. We are seeing a responsiveness rate that is very high as we exercise our alternatives to detention and our supervisorial capabilities. We are doing everything that we can to ensure that individuals check in with ICE, that appear for their proceedings, and if individuals abscond, then we will deploy our enforcement resources to address that absconsion and that failure to comply with legal requirements.
My next question has to do with the fact that over the last month and up until last week, CBP implemented the humanitarian parole process for Ukrainians, which we recently, our colleagues just was talking about. And you worked extensively, as was said, with the NGOs to process up to 1,000 Ukrainians per day at the San Isidro port of entry. Last week, the administration announced a new process for Ukrainians to apply for humanitarian parole prior to seeking admission to the United States, as was previously mentioned. It seems to me that the large number of Ukrainians processed through San Isidro seems to demonstrate that there is a much larger capacity for processing APOEs than many have assumed in the past. Do you agree that we should be processing more migrants, especially asylum seekers, through the land ports of entry? And if so, what are the department's plans for doing that?
Madam Chairwoman, the question goes to one of the elements of the six-pillar plan that I reflected in the memorandum issued yesterday. One of the elements of efficiency that we outline in one of those six pillars is in fact enhancing and increasing port of entry capacity to process individuals encountered at the border, trying to drive individuals to a safer, more orderly means of applying for asylum as our laws recognize. We used a virtual platform that we created to address an emergent situation created by the past administration, and that was the Camp Matamoros, which had individuals living in squalid conditions and suffering untold horrors, criminal horrors. We developed a platform where they could register, they could be interviewed by international organizations and assisted by non-governmental organizations in Mexico. And once they passed that screening, could actually be transported safely at a designated time at our port of entry for orderly processing. We are taking that virtual platform, CBP-1 is how we have termed it, and seeing how we can expand it to address the challenge at the southern border and maximize the efficiency of processing at the ports of entry.
Mr. Fleischman.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Thank you again, Mr. Secretary. Mr. Secretary, border patrol stations were designed for the short-term detention of single adult males, not for the family units and unaccompanied children crossing the border. Those stations are strained to the point where we have to shuttle migrants to other parts of the border just to keep up with processing. Every Border Patrol agent stuck processing migrants, providing security in a soft-sided facility, or attending to the basic humanitarian needs of those detained is not out in the field performing the law enforcement role they are paid and trained for. There are impacts to our ability to interdict drugs and criminal organization as a result. Your plan released late yesterday speaks to the backfilling with civilian personnel, but that drains resources from other components or requires a lengthy hiring process. Mr. Secretary, what is your long-term plan to get more agents in the field? Thank you.
Congressman, thank you so much. As I outlined, the hiring of personnel, contract personnel, does not drain other resources, other personnel resources in the Department of Homeland Security. And our fiscal year 2023 budget is a powerful example of how we are seeking additional resources from Congress to establish a more enduring solution than mere reliance on contract personnel. We have requested 300 more funding for 300 more Border Patrol agents, and we have requested funding for full-time case processing personnel. And we look forward to and hope for this committee's support of our fiscal year 2023 budget request in that regard and in all regards.
Mr. Secretary, the administration tried to roll back the Migrant Protection Program, which requires migrants to wait in Mexico for their court hearing, but was required by court order to reinstate the program. The Migrant Protection Program was used extensively by the last administration, but on average, only a handful of migrants are enrolled each day currently in any given Border Patrol sector. Why is the administration enrolling such a small number of migrants in this program, sir?
Congressman, I'm familiar with the migrant protection protocols, that the common language used to describe that is the Remain in Mexico program.
Correct.
And I think it's very important to understand that our implementation of that program requires a bilateral relationship. We need the collaboration of Mexico in the administration of that program. I have articulated quite clearly and quite strongly our disagreement with that program. I think what resulted from the prior administration's execution of that program underscores the reasons why I so significantly and ardently oppose it. We received, for example, a report of more than 1,500 incidents of murder, rape, torture, and other crimes committed against individuals who were subject to the Remain in Mexico program. So we're working with Mexico to administer that program in good faith, as we are required to do under the court's order, and to do so in a way that reflects and adheres to our values as a nation.
I think I'm going close on my time, so Madam Chair, I think I'll yield back. Thank you.
Mr. Cuellar.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Secretary, I think there's three stakeholders that we need to listen to, besides Congress, about the border issues. As you know, the immigration activists, number one. Number two, our men and women at the border. And number three, our border communities. I appreciate when you visited us down there in the border in McAllen, and you heard from mayors, county judges, county commissioners from Del Rio all the way down to Brownsville, covering Tony Gonzalez, myself, Philemon Vela, and Vicente Gonzalez district. And if you recall, my border folks, public officials were quite animated. I think now they're probably a little bit more animated because of what's happening on the border. And you recall, everything I say is pretty much, I repeat what they told you. And same from our men and women down there. So I would ask you to continue spending time, and I appreciate all the visits you've done, listening to our border communities, because there's a lot of concerns down there. Now, let me ask you a couple questions on, and I've looked at your plan, and again, I think this plan can work if it's implemented right. By that I mean is you keep mentioning the broken system, I guess the Trump administration did, but it was not any legislative changes. It was whatever the administration did. You can fix whatever they did, I assume, number one. But if I take you back to the Secretary Jay Johnson and Obama, they were able to treat the migrants with respect and dignity, but at the same time, when the law said you got to send them back, they sent them back. In fact, I worked with Secretary Johnson on showing images of people being returned to Honduras and the First Lady being there and taking them in. Now it's like we're afraid to show images of people going back. Y'all deport hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people, but all we see is images of people coming into the United States and no images of people going back when the law has to be enforced. And on top of that, there are over 1 million final deportation orders that have still not been executed, plus the 1.6 million people are still waiting on immigration. The reason I say that is, or you're looking at your plan, if you look at the expedited removal, if you use Title 42, it will take from 1 to 2 hours. If you use Title 8, it will take from 24 to 48 hours. What is your vision of, quote, expedited removal once Title 42 does go away?
Congressman, you'll recall, of course, that I served as a deputy secretary.
Correct.
When Jay Johnson served as a secretary, and prior to that, I was the director of U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, and we have worked together for many years. And I appreciate your prior law enforcement service as well as your service now. Let me say one thing, because I certainly want to make sure that if you have a misimpression with respect to the publication of removals and our communication plan around those removals, that I put that misimpression to rest, because we are indeed communicating robustly throughout the region, in the countries of origin, with respect to the removals that we have effected and the consequence regime that we have imposed upon individuals who have crossed into our country, who've been encountered at the border, who have no legal claim for relief here in the United States. So we are very robustly communicating those removals and those consequences. Expedited removal is something that we are focused upon very intensely, as I lay out in the plan. And in fact, I raised in Panama, where I was last week, with other countries, our need to accelerate the receipt of travel documents and the other mechanics that allow us to remove individuals as quickly as possible. And we are receiving increasing cooperation from a number of countries in the region. The benefit of expedited removal is actually captured in its term, the speed with which we can return individuals who have no basis here in the United States. And so we are drawing increased efficiencies as the plan demonstrates, and we are also working with our partners so that they can assist us in that regard.
I got about 4 seconds before my time. So I gave you the the time for Title 42 and time for Title 8. How much time would a expedite removal, and I'll close with that?
I think actually the processing of a Title 42 matter takes more time than the processing of another encounter. I will get you that detail. I don't want to misspeak, and I'll need to confirm.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Palazzo.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This committee provided $200 million in fiscal year '22 to DHS for joint processing centers on the border. These are supposed to be one-stop centers for processing illegal immigrants, and in my view, the faster we can do this, the better, because it looks like we're going to have yet another year where our taxpayers are going to foot the bill for billions of dollars for temporary facilities instead of having an actual solution. Where's the department on the plans for permanent joint processing facilities, and when will they be built, and what additional funding is needed in fiscal year '23 to get them done?
Congressman, I very much appreciate your support for the joint processing centers. We actually identify those as one element of our plan that is captured in my memorandum issued yesterday. We call them enhanced central processing centers in the plan because it is a very able model. It drives efficiency to have different parts of the Department of Homeland Security in one place, and actually to have the NGOs present there as well, so that we can administer the processing as quickly as possible. And I will provide you with greater detail with respect to the implementation of those plans, and very much appreciate your support for the centers.
Well, my support is tepid, but it's because out of a necessary requirement to handle the great influx of illegals, which I wish we wouldn't have to have this permanent procedure, but it seems like we definitely need it now.
And that, Congressman, if I may, because the migration challenge, as I said at the outset, is a regional phenomenon. Mm-hmm. That is exactly why we are engaged so robustly with our partners to the south to address the migratory flows that run throughout the Western Hemisphere and throughout the world. This is a very different situation than 10 years ago. We have more displaced individuals around the world than ever before. The extraordinarily powerful images, the desperation in Ukraine is, I think, the most poignant and heartbreaking example of that.
Yes, sir, and I agree, and I wish we had more than 5 minutes to discuss this, because I think you have a lot to add to the conversation as well as members of this committee. When we combined Homeland Security, there's 22 different departments, so I'm going to switch over to FEMA. Real quick, National Flood Insurance Program, Risk Rating 2.0. FEMA is moving forward with implementing Risk Rating 2.0 for existing policyholders despite serious transparency concerns that I and others have raised surrounding the new premium rate system and its methodology. I've reached out to FEMA multiple times seeking clarity for this new rating system, but our concerns have gone unanswered. Any failure to consider mitigation efforts in setting rates is especially concerning due to the estimates that thousands of Mississippi families will face NFIP rate increases for years to come, potentially making the cost of flood insurance unaffordable for some policyholders. Mississippi families and families all across the nation, to be accurate, and should not be left holding the bill for FEMA's inability to be transparent about the significant changes it's implementing. There have been several letters sent to you and FEMA regarding concerns from members with districts across the United States. The transparency in premium increases to policyholders has been lacking. Was there ever any conversation within your agency to delay the implementation of Risk Rating 2.0?
Congressman, I'm very disheartened to hear your concerns continue with respect to the transparency with which we are exercising the implementation of Risk Rating 2.0. The goal of that program is actually to increase access to flood insurance and to recalibrate the premiums with that goal in mind. One of the top priorities that I've set out for this department is to increase openness and transparency, and I'm going to engage with you personally with FEMA to make sure that your constituents have the information they need.
Yeah, our number one goal is to make sure flood insurance remains affordable and available, and this is going to hurt low to moderate income communities more than it will the wealthy. And I do have some bills, and I don't know if you've had a chance to review them, HR 5793 and HR 5802. If I will get you those numbers, and it's bipartisan effort, not just to reform NFIP, but also to get a short-term delay so these rates do not go into effect. And if the chairwoman would allow me, I just have one quick question, and I'll end this. We don't have to go to round three. Thank you, Madam Chair. In the time I've been in Congress, I've seen constant attacks against the Jones Act by special interest group bent on allowing foreign ships and crews to push out American sailors and shipbuilders. Last year, President Joe Biden signed a Made in America executive order strengthening federal Buy American requirements. The order explicitly emphasized the importance of Jones Act shipping, which stands as a rare presidential endorsement for the U.S. maritime sector within days of the start of the new administration. My question, simple, do you support the Jones Act, and are you committed to rigorous enforcement of the Jones Act?
I do, and I am, Congressman, and I want you to know that the President's Buy American initiative is something that he is holding the entire administration to. We have strict protocols to which we must adhere, and we do so quite proudly with respect to our contracting to make sure that we are indeed buying American. It's something we're very proud to be a part of. I do believe in the Jones Act. I do support it. I know I have a waiver authority, and we exercise that quite prudently in only cases of emergency, as the Colonial Pipeline incident was one.
All right. Well, thank you, Mr. Secretary. I yield back.
Ms. Underwood.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Secretary, you previously stated that domestic violent extremism is the #1 terrorist threat facing our country. In your testimony, you stated that the intelligence community assesses that racially or ethnically motivated violent extremists who advocate for the superiority of the white race, including white supremacists, present the most lethal domestic violent extremism movement in the homeland. Beyond designating domestic violent extremism as a national priority area for FEMA grant programs, what else is DHS doing to combat this terrorist threat?
Congresswoman Underwood, we do indeed consider domestic violent extremism the most significant terrorism-related threat facing the homeland. Not only did I identify this area as a national priority area in the FEMA grant programs, but we created a special section in the Office of Intelligence and Analysis to focus on this terrorism-related threat. We also stood up the Center for Prevention Programs and Partnership, CP3, to work with communities to empower and equip communities to address this growing threat within their respective jurisdictions, recognizing that the community personnel are best situated to do so. Our job is to resource and support them with training, with funding, and the like. We very much appreciate this committee's support of the Nonprofit Security Grant Program, and we have submitted in the President's FY 2023 budget a further increase of that grant program to $360 million from its currently appropriated funds. I was in Detroit several weeks ago, meeting with faith-based organizations, talking to them about how we can increase access to this critically needed grant program. Equality of access is a core principle of ours, where the otherwise under-resourced organizations might not have the wherewithal to access the grant programs and yet don't have any less of a need for them. So we're very focused on this mission set.
Great. Another huge threat to our homeland is mis- and disinformation. You noted that it's a concern of yours at the border, with human smuggling organizations peddling misinformation to exploit vulnerable migrants for profit. One of my main concerns about disinformation is that foreign adversaries attempt to destabilize our elections by targeting people of color with disinformation campaigns. After it became clear that there was foreign meddling in our 2016 election, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence authored a report on the disinformation tactics used by Russia's Internet Research Agency, the IRA, to interfere in the election. The report found that, quote, no single group of Americans was targeted by the IRA information operatives more than African Americans. A newer trend that we saw in the 2020 election and already in the 2022 midterms is that disinformation is being heavily targeted at Spanish-speaking voters, sparking and fueling conspiracy theories. DHS and its components play a big role in addressing mis- and disinformation in Spanish and other languages. Can you share what steps you've taken and what future plans you have to address Spanish language mis- and disinformation through department-wide approach?
Congresswoman, we have a number of different offices engaged in this critical effort. Of course, our Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency has an entire effort focused on election security as part of its mission set. Our Office of Policy, Office of Planning, Policy and Strategy, also is a leading effort. Our Undersecretary for Policy, Rob Silvers, is co-chair with our Principal Deputy General Counsel, Jennifer Daskell, in leading a just recently constituted misinformation, disinformation governance board. So we're bringing, the goal is to bring the resources of the department together to address this threat. I just read a very interesting study that underscores the importance of the point that you make, the spread of mis- and disinformation in minority communities specifically, and we are focused on that in the context of our CP3 and other efforts, and
Sure.
I'd be pleased
But
to share
Mr.
more.
Secretary, what I've heard you describe are internal organizations. What we are looking for is to make sure that there's external communications with the American public, including those for whom Spanish is their predominant language, to make sure that the information that the department has around mis- and disinformation campaigns is reaching those individuals.
And Congresswoman, forgive me if I misspoke, but I provided you the details of the internal structures that we are using to communicate externally
Okay,
with the
fantastic.
American public.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Ms. Henson.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, again. I want to talk now a little bit about taxpayer money, because I'm hearing again from Iowans on a regular basis, they're appalled by this mishandling of what's happened at the border and the resources that they send, their hard-earned paychecks. They care about what is happening with those dollars, as do I, and I hope you do too, and we share that. So yesterday afternoon, you published this memo, right, this plan, and I want to point specifically to page 11 and what you write there, which is DHS is currently determining which federal agencies can provide support through an interagency agreement, and this is concerning to me. We've heard that the administration is considering removing healthcare providers from the VA, for example, doctors and nurses whose taxpayer dollars and their intent is to help care for our veterans. So my question to you today is, yes or no answer, is the Department of Homeland Security planning to reallocate resources, doctors and nurses from our VA system intended to care for our veterans to help care for illegal immigrants at our southern border?
Congresswoman, let me be clear, because an interagency effort is precisely what the challenge of migration requires, and it's not specific to 2022, nor 2021, nor 2020, or the years preceding.
Right, but I'm just asking you a yes or no question.
Oh.
Are you planning on taking resources away from our veterans to help deal with the surge at our southern border? That's a yes or no question.
Actually, Congresswoman, the resources that the medical personnel from the Veterans Administration would allocate to this effort is under the judgment of the Secretary of Veterans Affairs, who prioritizes the interests of veterans above all others for very noble and correct reasons.
Do you know if have you had any conversations about reallocating those resources?
I have not personally, but of course our teams, our personnel have, and I'd be very pleased to follow up with you.
Yeah. Our veterans need to know that the care that they've earned is going to be provided to them and not to those at our southern border.
That is
the other
what
thing
the
I'd like to
entire-
ask you about, Mr.
If I
Secretary.
may, that is what the entire Veterans Administration is dedicated to do. and we have worked with the Veterans Administration not only in addressing this challenge, but in actually addressing the cares and needs of those veterans who also have been experiencing the immigrant experience in the United States. We have people who have served in our military before even being naturalized. And so we work very closely to care for the needs of veterans in our country.
Okay, well, I would expect an answer specifically as to whether or not you intend to take those resources from our veterans, because they're asking us those questions, and they deserve to have an answer from us specifically. The other thing I want to talk about is taxpayer money that Congress has appropriated. This is a picture from our southern border of taxpayer money sitting and rusting. This is probably good American steel, should have been used to fill the gaps in the wall that, in your memo, you mentioned are being exploited by the cartels right now. So do you have anything to say to the taxpayers about this right here, these pieces of steel sitting there rusting when we have this crisis at our southern border? How much has halting the wall construction cost American taxpayers because they're having to divert those resources to handle the surge?
Congresswoman, as I articulated earlier in this hearing, we have an obligation to spend the monies that Congress has appropriated for the wall. The way in which we are doing that is to achieve the safety and security of the American people, and to do so in a responsible way. We are also spending money addressing infirmities in the wall that was built. We're seeing corrosion and other failings. So it's a very complex picture.
This is corrosion right here, and this has driven people between the point of entries to the hands of the cartels, in your own words. So I think this is, to taxpayers, they see this as a huge slap in the face, to see these pieces sitting there that could be used to actually deter people from coming into these into our country, not at the points of entry. The last question I had specifically is about the illegals that are coming into the interior and how they're being transported here. How much does transporting migrants into the homeland cost our taxpayers right now, and are they still being flown into our country?
Congresswoman, individuals who are transported from the point of encounter to detention are transported in different ways. They are transported from a Border Patrol facility to an ICE detention facility. They are transported.
But they're also being flown into places like Iowa.
If I may, Congresswoman, they are also flown to their countries of origin when they have been removed and their claims for relief have failed. I would be pleased to provide you with the specific numbers, the expenses of the administration of our immigration system, and the laws that we are obligated to honor, which we do.
Yeah. I want to know how much you're spending to come into the country and not to return them to other countries. Thank you.
Mr. Aguilar.
A lot of places to potentially go, but I feel compelled, Mr. Secretary, to also mention, I've heard some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, who I have a lot of respect for. Not everybody who presents themselves at a processing center at the southern border is doing so for nefarious purposes. And it's frustrating to hear time and time again the fact that they want to have conversations about how Ukrainians are treated at the southern border, but using terms like illegals rather than those who are presenting themselves for lawful asylum. It's frustrating. It's frustrating, the dual standards in place. I'd also note, Mr. Secretary, I've been part of a number of trips down to the southern border when the prior structure was being built. Members of our own military showed us how they could penetrate these barriers quickly. We knew that at the time they were constructed, that they could be penetrated. This was done for show. Folks down there know this, that there are many ways to help secure our borders, and a physical structure is one component. But as you and the department have said time and time again, there are other factors that can be more helpful. I wanted to ask you a question. You mentioned in-country processing. One way to address the true issue of surging migration is to talk about root causes and expanding the ways individuals in countries can apply for legal pathways in their home countries so they don't have to make that dangerous journey to the southwest border. In-country processing is not new to DHS. In fact, DHS has been setting up infrastructure for in-country processing that would allow migrants to apply for different immigration pathways legally and fairly. Some might be supported in countries maybe in Eastern Europe by all of our colleagues, but this is done throughout other countries as well. Can you give us an overview of where this is done in country, where in-country processing broadly stands, and what authorities and resources you're going to need from Congress in order to meet those needs?
Thank you, Congressman. Let me, if I can, preface my response to your specific question by commenting on the extraordinary benefits of technology and the dedication of technological capabilities at the border, and that is precisely why our fiscal year 2023 budget invests significantly on technological assets. So there are really two parts to your question. One is an enduring solution to the reason why people out of desperation flee the homes that they have built in the countries of their origin in which they have been raised. And that is addressing the root causes. And this president, the Biden-Harris administration, has been very dedicated to addressing those root causes and investing in addressing them and doing so with civil society. The other means is by developing safe, orderly, and humane pathways so individuals do not have to risk their lives in the hands of smuggling organizations that exploit their vulnerabilities purely for profit. And I think a shining example of one such pathway is the Central American Minors Program, which we are scaling up, where minors would not have to place their well-being or have their parents, their desperate parents, place their well-being in the hands of smugglers, and they can access our system should they qualify for relief here in the States. We have developed a migrant processing center in the northern part of Guatemala for that very same purpose, and we are expanding those programs as a pillar of a safe, orderly, and humane system. There's one other element, of course, that can provide an enduring solution, which everyone agrees upon and no one has reached, and that is legislation.
And there are legislative solutions that the House has sent in a bipartisan way over to the Senate, and I agree with you. Passing legislation is always preferred in order to fix this issue.
If I may, Congressman, the President sent proposed legislation on the first day he was in office.
If we were to go down to the Northern Guatemala Processing Center, what would that look like? What does staffing look like at the processing center?
So I visited one of the processing centers, Congressman, and at that time, what it was focused upon was actually the reintegration of Guatemalans whom we had removed under our authorities. A proof of a couple very important points. One is that those who do not qualify for relief under our laws will be removed, and we do remove them. And two, to avoid recidivism, we have to work with the countries of origin to make sure that those individuals can achieve stability in their lives so they do not feel compelled out of desperation to try again. It's a very complex challenge, and we have to address the root causes of it ultimately. We have to build lawful, orderly, humane pathways, and then once and for all, we have to fix our immigration system that has been broken for so very many years.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Yield back, Madam Chair.
Mr. Rutherford.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Secretary, in September of last year, under your direction, ICE implemented new enforcement guidelines. And these guidelines focused on the use of prosecutorial discretion. And stated in there was, it is estimated that there are more than 11 million undocumented or otherwise removable non-citizens in the United States. We do not have the resources to apprehend and see the removal of every one of these non-citizens. Therefore, we need to exercise our discretion to determine whom to prioritize for immigration enforcement action. And I can tell you, as a former sheriff myself, I know the limitations that budgets can put on you. But one of the questions that I have and would like an explanation for is, in fiscal year 19, ICE deported 359,000 illegal aliens from the interior of our country. In 2020, 185,000. And that had about 4 years of Trump deportations in there. And then last year with the same resources, they only deported 59,000. What's going on?
Congressman, I can answer this question very succinctly, but I want to take a step back, if I may.
Sure.
Because I served as a federal prosecutor for 12 years. First as an assistant United States attorney for almost 9, and then for the United States attorney in the Central District of California for about 3 years. We had 186 criminal prosecutors when I served as the United States attorney. We could have dedicated 186 of those prosecutors, every single one of them, to narcotics cases. We could have dedicated every single one of them to significant fraud cases. But what we did with the resources we had is we allocated those resources to have the greatest public safety impact in the many different areas for which we were responsible. The concept of prosecutorial discretion, I know you're very familiar with it as a former sheriff, is an underpinning of smart and effective law enforcement. And I do not believe, and many people in law enforcement do not believe, that public safety is a quantitative metric, but rather a qualitative one. And if one takes a look, if I may, if one takes a look at the removals that we have effected, we have removed more serious criminals than the prior administration did. And I have data, and I can provide you with that specific data.
Mr. Secretary, what I'd like to know is, what is the resource need to get back to where we're focusing and have the prosecutorial capacity to deport 359,000 who need and should be legally deported?
This is all about maximizing the public safety impact of the resources we do have. 46% of ICE removals were for people convicted of felonies or aggravated felonies, compared to 18% during the previous 4 years and 17% the year before that.
But Mr. Secretary, if I can push back on that just a little bit, that percentage is of a 4 times the size number. So I think America was much safer when we deported 359,000, whether they were for serious felonies or serious misdemeanors. But 359 compared to 59,000, that's not safer, I don't think. So, I'll leave that there, but I would love to help you out with resources if that's what you need to get back to where we can, see ICE deporting 359,000 people a year who need it. Now, let me move. My time's about out. Last question. So, you've talked a lot today about, the fact that you're focusing on the irregularities of immigration coming from the South, talking to Panama and all of that. You've talked about targeting and disrupting the transnational criminal organizations, utilizing the NGOs more and more, administering consequences for unlawful entry, speeding up the CBP processing efficiency by adding those case processors, and addressing the issue by surging people to the border. And I think the answer to your question was yes on the VA. And so my question is, if this was all done starting in September of 21, according to your written testimony, and we still have these problems today at our southern border, I think if you ask probably 2/3 of the country, they'll tell you the border is not secure. And so my question is, now we're about to lift Title 42, and I don't hear a plan to address that. These things you've already implemented. These things are there now. What is going to change in response to Title 42?
Oh, Congressman, we are building further in implementing consistent with the 6 pillars that I identify in the memo that I published to make clear that we do have a plan, and we are preparing and have been preparing, and we're implementing our plans. We are building further. We are intensifying our efforts. We are increasing our efforts and enhancing them. So we are not done.
Okay. Madam Chair, I see my time's up. I yield back.
Mr. Secretary, I don't know if there's any other comments that you want to make in terms of clarifying any other statements or concerns that have been raised at this time?
Madam Chairwoman, we are addressing very complex issues. I have a great deal to say. I look forward to engaging further with members of this committee, and I'm deeply grateful to you and to Ranking Member Fleischman and to the distinguished members of this committee for their support, for your support of the Department of Homeland Security and the extraordinary 250,000 individuals who sacrifice so much each day to accomplish our mission.
I understand there are no other questions from members, but I do want to ask one last question about an agency that is absolutely critical to our security, and that is TSA. The President's budget request proposes nearly $1 billion in additional spending to implement changes to TSA's pay structure and to extend collective bargaining and merit system protection to TSA personnel. Can you explain what these changes are and why they are important?
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. The TSA personnel help secure our country every single day. They also help facilitate lawful trade every single day, a very difficult job. They deserve to be paid commensurate with their colleagues in the federal government. They deserve collective bargaining rights like so many of their colleagues in the government. This is about parity and about recognition and about gratitude for their extraordinary service.
And with that, if there are no further questions, we will conclude today's hearing. Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary, for being here. And I'm sure we have other questions that we will be submitting to you for the record. And the Subcommittee on Homeland Security stands adjourned.